firsthand from Accenture. Please welcome Derek Lande.
Okay. Thanks a million. Absolutely. Actually, I'm not going to use the podium because I like to pace a little. But what I want to do is, my day job is I work with clients who come to us and say, look, what's coming in terms of technology? And they ask us, so what are the emerging technology trends? And if I think of trends, to me, it feels like these days everybody is publishing a set of trends. Everybody is trying to predict the future. To a certain extent, there's so much talk now about specific technologies, about blockchain, about AI, etc. I'm going to try and not talk about any of those today, even though I am going to talk about trends. To me, the most important thing is actually talking a little bit about why are we talking so much about trends? Why is it that we're actually seeing such an incredible level of pace of development, of excitement, of buzz, whatever it is? To me, that's actually what's important, because I'm never going to be the one to come up with solutions to the problems which we have. But what I want us to do today is to see how do we actually think about some of those underlying things which will inspire other people to be able to go and come up with the actual solutions. The main thing I want to do, and I'm actually delighted the Minister set off very much on this note, I think the biggest thing when we talk about the future is that we need to really think positively. Because so much of the time, particularly when we talk about either politics or about technology, if you picked up the news these days, it's so much doom and gloom. When in reality, whether you're talking about development or whether you're talking about the sheer impact that tech has had, my own view is it's had an incredibly positive impact, and we need to get that balance back into the conversation. But also in terms of positivity, I think it was Bill Gates put the comment as saying, look, let's be realistic and say we always overestimate how much is going to happen in the next 2 years, but we underestimate how much is going to happen in the next 10. So I want to take that long-term view, because that's, I suppose, what will drive solutions. Today I'm going to talk, broadly speaking, about 5 things. I'm going to do them really quickly, but I want to just set that context for the day. And the first thing I want to talk about is what I call throwing mud. And this is going to be a quick one, but it's to set the context. So for me, it's a case of going, we all know the shift in the economy in terms of the biggest companies in the world has very much shifted towards the tech industry. So from 2001, where you had one tech company in the top 5, to by 2016, where all of the top 5 are tech companies, there's a lot of money in tech now. Then you look at startup land, and you say, actually, this is the companies who've hit a valuation of $1 billion. Now, in some ways, those valuations are fictional. They're based on someone putting a small amount of money into a company. But at the same time, though, if you look at from February 2014 was when you started to see a massive acceleration. You saw enormous money flooding into the tech sector. So I'm going to pause there and say, the question everyone's asking us is this real, or is this the dot-com bubble all over again? And my view on this is, it just doesn't matter. Because worst case scenario, I do take the view of you throw enough mud and some of it sticks. So this is where it comes back. This is where I'm coming back to it. Even if 1/10 of those startups produce something innovative, different, whatever it is, we're seeing a pace of economic development, a pace of research, and a pace of technology change that we've never seen before. And I think that technology, whether we use that for commercial purposes or whether we use it for public good, we can use it for both. So I think innovation, investment, etc., my own view is it's great. So the question is how do we actually maximize some of the benefits out of that? And to me, some of that comes back to actually understanding the pace. And this is where I want to talk about 2 things, pace and blenders. So if I think of pace, the biggest challenge which we have is to actually think about how that pace is changing. So normally, when we think pace and we go in and speak to a company, a client, they think of stock market cycles. Quarter on quarter, how are we seeing steady growth? When we think of improvement, we think of gradual improvement. But the reason why we think things are probably a little bit different now, and why some of those valuations are justifying themselves, is because there's a lot of people who are saying, actually, the biggest thing that science and technology have changed now is we now have the technology to enable actual exponential growth, that things are getting better at a pace that's faster than ever before. For a long time, we never really noticed it because it was quite deceptive. Because if you think about exponential growth, at the start, that increasing pace is quite small steps. But there is an argument for saying you get to the point where we actually start to cross over into the pace is increasing so much every year that you actually get some of those real disruption effects. So now the biggest thing behind all of the trends isn't about what the specific technology is, but about the fact that the improvement we'll see over the next 2 years will be much bigger than what we saw over the last 2 years. And it's about how do you actually keep up with that. This is nothing new. We've talked about Moore's law for decades at this point in terms of CPU power is one thing. But if I think of all of the other things that are increasing at either, I suppose, either their potential or in terms of decreasing in terms of price, there's actually lots of these exponential curves. So if I take solar power. 10 years ago, it was about $4 for 1 kilowatt hour of solar power. Then, coal, you want to compare it? 6 cents. There was no economic argument for it. Fast forward, so this was 3 years ago in the United States. They did a deal at 4.3 cents. Then Abu Dhabi, or sorry, no, it was India, 3.8 cents. Then you had Abu Dhabi do a deal, moving on. Chile, 2.9. Being a bit slow for me. Abu Dhabi, 2.4. Las Vegas, 2.3, you get the idea. So in the case of 3 years, it's halved again. So to me, that's exciting. It's the case of saying, actually, the pace at which we actually saw that decrease from it being completely economically infeasible to being actually something which is clearly cheaper than coal is actually very significant. Now, we may not be able to get those prices in Ireland thanks to our weather, but you're seeing similar trends in terms of things like wind power, and eventually that will catch up as well. But where this becomes significant is, in China, there was 100 coal power plants that were at some stage in the construction process, from planning to bricks in the ground, and they cancelled them. So in my mind, one of the biggest challenges for businesses, for anybody, in terms of when they're thinking about what they do today, is that from the time you start a project to the time you finish it, the whole business case, or the technology, or the economic assumptions you base that on, may have changed in a very short period of time. It's a challenge, but it's also pretty exciting. And to me, it's again, you can get into loads of different technologies. So you think about battery prices falling faster even than that pace. You think of one of my favorite ones, the cost of sequencing a genome. The first one cost about 2 billion, then it was 100 million, and people said, well, actually, yeah, it will be kind of come down gradually, but it's fallen down to the point where by 2007, people were sequencing a full person's genome for $1,000. Last year, how much was someone doing it for? $100. So to me, it's a case of saying, actually, $100, that's cheaper than a blood test in some countries. And we're sequencing a person's entire genome. What kind of potential does that open up simply because something that was magic 10 years ago is now affordable? I think that's kind of exciting. So to me, the biggest impact, though, is this is where the blenders come in. Because where true innovation comes is not about taking an individual technology and making it better, but it's about combining those things. To me, it's a case of going, if you think of the iPhone as being one of the things that actually, in my mind, was quite a monumental shift, that was a culmination of wireless technology, screen technology, microelectronics. It's about combining ideas. We're going to see it's about battery technology combining with renewable energy sources. It's about biotechnology, I'm going to talk more about that later, combining with big data and analytics, et cetera. It's all about how do you say, recognize the pace and think about how they actually interact with each other. Third thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the free economy. And there's loads of examples of this. Sometimes they're not free. Some things are getting cheaper. So Uber making transport cheaper, Amazon making retail cheaper, Airbnb making hotels cheaper. In some cases, people are actually seeing things that they once paid for are free. So people don't really use long-term telecom services anymore. People, a lot of particularly millennials, they get their news off Facebook. They don't go out and buy a newspaper. People use the free tiers on Spotify, et cetera. This is disruptive, but it's also something which opens up things for people. If I think about the biggest shift in this is that I think of all the things we used to have on our desk. I love this picture. Back in the 80s, all of the clutter that you had, but these were all things that were made and built by people and people made money off. Now, the economy has fundamentally shifted to the point where it's all about digital services. That's what the desks look like today, and that's why we all have hot desks, so we don't actually have a space. Our lives have become more virtual. But it's also about saying, what kind of change is that driving? That kind of change is driving things like, look at what happened to photographs. The pace is not just about the pace of technology development, but it's also about the pace at which consumers will adopt something. So if you think about it, photographs, analog photos were the thing up until the mid-2000s, and then in the space of 2-3 years, an industry that basically had lasted probably for 80-90 years, collapsed. What did that mean? Kodak went from, in 1996, being a $28 billion company, in 2012 to being bankrupt. But to me, this is where the positivity comes in as well. Because what we did is, we actually saw, I'll take an example relevant to the building we're in, look at Instagram. Instagram in 2012, that was the point they were acquired by Facebook. What I thought was significant is this was a team of 13 people who built an amazing product that was available to everybody for free. And it changed an industry. It changed, I actually think it's a case of changed how we communicate people, communicate with people, changed how we remember stories, etc. A lot of this was what drove the digital photography revolution in my mind. So a lot of this is about saying, when things become free, it actually fundamentally changes people's behaviors. And I will come back to that, because to me, one of the other impacts of free or cheap is democratization. So a lot of people have referred to things like mobile phone access in the developing world becoming more ubiquitous and the impact that has had on people to be able to know prices in another village, to be able to get help, whatever it may be. But you also think people are dreaming big. Facebook have looked at around, I think it was around balloons, I think was the idea around internet access. SpaceX, the idea is they want to launch thousands of satellites into space. Whatever means it is, one of the views now is that internet access is going to be something that will become much more ubiquitous throughout the world. So I want to sum it up this way. By 2025, people are saying there'll be 4.2 billion new minds connected to the world, connected to the internet. And to me, this is the single biggest cause for optimism. Because if I think of the last time we did something even close to that, it was 1 billion people in China being lifted out of poverty and being connected to the world. So if I think about the increasing pace of development, the increasing pace of why is it that we have such valuations, etc., a lot of it is about saying that innovation and R&D doesn't just come out of the West. It comes out of Asia. Now you think about 4.2 billion people in Africa, other parts of Asia, etc., who suddenly get connected to the world, and I'm bloody optimistic. I think this is so exciting because of what those people can do. Those people will create things, they'll consume things, they'll invent things. And I think that is the reason for optimism. So what I want you to do is I want you to say, imagine if a couple of things were true. I want you to imagine if energy became almost free. Maybe that's not going to happen in 2 years, but will it happen in 20? I want you to imagine, would that mean that vertical farming would become a reality, and would we have a new way of feeding the world? I want you to imagine if cheap desalination existed, and what would that do, for example, for politics in some countries where water is a serious issue? I want you to imagine if those 4.2 billion new minds got access to new forms of education, free courseware, for example, provided by MIT, and so on. I think that's exciting. I want you to imagine if lots of companies are making artificial diamonds for $2 a carat, what that will do, because then certain life choices will become a lot cheaper. So it's a case of going, there's lots of things that will become free that actually open up so much potential. So the challenge I'd say is think about some of those curves. Think about the curves of things that are getting cheaper or getting better, and what could you do when that happens? Don't think 2 years ahead, think 5, think 10. So to me, it's a case of saying we're in a world where we assume that things are scarce. And there always will be lots of things that are scarce. I'm not going to paint too rosy an optimistic picture. But to me, it's about saying, actually, how do we start to think about that opportunity of abundance? And think about what will be abundant going forward, and how do we grasp that? So the last thing I want to talk about is, to me, it's about saying, how do we actually think about this in the post-digital era? Because a lot of it has focused on data, has focused on the arts of physics, etc. But I also think it's a case of going, we are going to have some really exciting things happening. So if I think about it, genetics, I think will be both the opportunity and issue of our generation. We've talked a lot about political debate and so on. I think it's going to be big. You think about the fact that we've now got the first treatments being approved based on CRISPR. You think about the fact that we actually think we know the genes that can impact some of these different things. And I kind of go, lean muscles, awesome. Extra strong bones, brilliant. But then I look at things like intelligence, and I go, how much of that comes back to what it means to be to our identities? And I think we're going to have bloody big political debates, unlike anything we've seen before. So debate is always going to go hand in hand with progress. That is an inevitability, but I'm optimistic. So to me, it's again, genetics is not just going to be about saying, how do we solve for, about people, but it's also about saying, what is the impact is that going to have on industry? There's people saying, actually, can we make leather that is naturally the perfect shade of pink? Grow it in a vat so we don't have to have animals in a farm. Are we going to have companies who, for example, are already saying, we do genetic testing of food to make sure it's actually what you're buying? I thought this was a brilliant example of a company who, they actually went in, did a test in a large US supermarket chain of their vegetarian sausages, and they found that of those sausages, about 30% of them actually contain meat. So again, the progress we're making, kind of scary, but also very interesting. And the third one, I think this comes back to a little bit on the political debate. AthletiGen are a company who are saying that they will take a genetic profile of somebody and they will say, what's the potential of that person as an athlete? Now, I'm kind of going, a lot of people have seen Moneyball and the application of big data to sports. And I'm kind of going, what's going to happen when they start using this technology with 5-year-olds? And it's a case of going, kid goes in, and they say, well, actually, you're never really going to be a great sports star. And to me, that's slightly tragic. Because I'm kind of going, when I was 6, I really believed I was going to play for Liverpool someday. I really believed it. And you know what? That's why I enjoyed it. And you know what? Ignorance sometimes is bliss. So to me, an awful lot of this comes back to about getting that balance. This technology is going to be wonderful and will change the world, but it's also going to be about how do we, I think we just need to say, look, how do we keep the potential and dreams for every child at the core of that as well? Nobody is limited, no matter how much data we have. I think there's plenty of examples of how that's broken. So to me, increasingly, this comes back to how do we strike that balance between having clear purpose for what we do as a tech industry, as people, everything, ethics and trust. We could talk a lot about those topics. They're the same issues today, and they're going to be the same issues we're talking about in 10 years' time. So the last thing I'm going to say is, what does this mean for us individually? And I think this comes back to a couple of things. I want to ask you a simple question. I want you to imagine, how far away is 30 linear steps? 30 steps are the same distance away. I can kind of picture it. I'd probably get close to the back of the room. I then want you to ask yourself, how far away are 30 exponential steps? So I want you to visualize that. You get about 26 times around the world. So to me, it's about saying, are we all going to be able to think in 30 exponential steps? No. But when we imagine what's possible, to me, the biggest thing that we should take away is how do we stop thinking linearly and start thinking exponentially? Let's be ambitious, take advantage of all the technology that's coming. Let's challenge ourselves to think exponentially, challenge ourselves to think globally. And just, to me, the biggest thing is we just need to keep the positivity. We'll have challenges, but there is so much opportunity. So look, I think this was the idea. To me, this is not about individual technologies, but about the right mindset, thinking about what's driving them, and looking at those root causes to find where those opportunities are. That, to me, is what really is the trend. So thanks a million.